Under duress. The covenant that never was.
Subscribe. Sign in. Under Duress Part 5. Open in app. Listen via. Under Duress Part 5. The Digital Covenant. MXTM aka Pirate 1 or VJ Tsunami X. July 1st, 2026. Chapter 21. Terms of Service. No document in human history has been agreed to by more people, read by fewer of them, or carried legal weight so thoroughly disconnected from genuine comprehension as the contemporary Terms of Service Agreement. This is not hyperbole. It is a measurable feature of the contemporary digital economy, and it deserves to open Part 5 because it represents, in concentrated and almost laboratory pure form, every mechanism this book has examined across the preceding 20 chapters, compressed into a single interaction most of the population now performs dozens of times before breakfast. The document designed not to be read. Begin with what the Terms of Service Agreement actually is, stripped of the legal and commercial euphemism surrounding it. A contract, in the full sense examined in Chapter 1, governing data collection, usage rights, dispute resolution, liability limitation, and frequently the unilateral right of the issuing platform to modify the agreement's terms at will, presented to a population overwhelmingly expected, and overwhelmingly observed, to accept without reading. This expectation is not incidental to the document's design. It is, in the most literal sense, available anywhere in this book, engineered into it. Terms of Service Agreements have grown, across the past 2 decades, to lengths frequently exceeding tens of thousands of words, written in a legal register specifically unsuited to rapid comprehension by a general population, presented through interfaces that offer a single, frictionless button, I agree, requiring a fraction of a second to activate, against a document that would require, by independent academic estimate, considerably longer to read in full than most users spend on the entire platform in a typical week. No institution examined in this book has achieved a cleaner demonstration of Chapter 3's fraud by omission. No individual clause is false, the entire document is technically available for inspection, and the practical effect is a population agreeing at industrial scale to terms they have not read and, were they to attempt reading them, would frequently lack the specialized legal training to fully interpret regardless. This satisfies Chapter 1's contractual signature requirement perfectly. It satisfies almost none of Chapter 4's capacity to know. The alternatives test applied to the single functional platform. Chapter 2's 3-part test for distinguishing genuine consent from structural duress applies to Terms of Service Agreements with unusual clarity. Because the digital economy has, across a remarkably short span of decades, consolidated an extraordinary share of essential social, commercial, and informational infrastructure into a small number of platforms each occupying, within their specific function, something close to a monopoly position. A user dissatisfied with a given platform's Terms of Service faces, in a genuine technical sense, the option of declining and using an alternative. In a substantive sense, for the specific functions these platforms have come to perform, the social graph maintaining contact with one's existing community, the search infrastructure mediating access to information, the communication infrastructure required for professional and personal coordination, genuinely comparable alternatives are frequently unavailable, not because competitors do not exist on paper, but because the value of these particular platforms derives substantially from network effects. The platform is valuable specifically because the user's existing community already uses it, a value no competing platform lacking that same community can replicate regardless of how favorable its terms might otherwise be. This produces exactly the alternatives test failure examined throughout this book. A menu that is technically plural but substantively singular, where the realistic alternative to accepting the dominant platform's terms is not a comparable platform under better terms, but exclusion from the social and professional infrastructure an increasing share of contemporary life now assumes as a baseline precondition for participation. This is Chapter 2's structural duress in close to its purest digital form. No single platform threatens the user directly, and yet the cumulative architecture of network effect consolidation leaves, agree to these terms or don't participate in contemporary social and professional life, as the only realistically available menu for a substantial and growing range of essential digital functions. The right to modify unilaterally. A further feature of the standard Terms of Service Agreement deserves particular attention, because it represents a contractual structure with few genuine precedents anywhere else examined in this book. The explicit reservation by the issuing platform of the right to modify the agreement's terms at any future point, frequently with notice requirements satisfied by nothing more than posting the revised terms somewhere on the platform itself, and frequently with continued use of the platform, treated as acceptance of whatever revised terms have been posted. This structure inverts Chapter 1's foundational distinction between contract and covenant in a particularly stark way. A covenant, properly understood, requires continuous voluntary renewal by both parties. A contract, even in its weaker form, typically requires both parties' assent to any material modification of its terms. The unilateral modification clause grants one party, the platform, the capacity to alter the relationship's terms without requiring the other party's renewed, affirmative consent to the altered terms, while preserving, through the continued use constitutes acceptance framing, the legal fiction that the user's ongoing presence on the platform represents exactly the kind of fresh, voluntary agreement the modification would otherwise require. This is, in effect, proxy consent, the mechanism examined in Chapter 8, granted by the user to the platform over the user's own future agreement, exercised not by any guardian appointed under the careful fiduciary standards Chapter 8 described, but by the very party whose interest the modified terms will typically serve. No fiduciary duty attaches to a platform's exercise of this reserved modification right. No standard requires the modification to serve the user's interest, or even to leave the user's interest unharmed. The user has, in the original act of accepting the unread initial terms, effectively granted the platform a standing proxy over all future terms the platform might subsequently choose to impose. A transfer of ongoing consent-making authority more total than almost any other mechanism examined across this entire book, accomplished through a single tap requiring less deliberate attention than most people give to selecting their morning beverage. Arbitration clauses and the foreclosure of recourse. A final structural feature deserves attention because it closes the loop on whatever sovereignty the preceding mechanisms have left intact. The mandatory arbitration clause, now standard across the overwhelming majority of consumer-facing digital terms of service, requiring users to resolve disputes through private arbitration rather than through courts, frequently paired with a waiver of the user's right to participate in class action litigation. The practical effect of this structure, examined against the economics this book traced in Part 4, is to ensure that whatever genuine harm a platform's practices might cause an individual user, harm frequently too small in any individual instance to justify the cost of private arbitration, but substantial in aggregate across the platform's entire user base, remains structurally unaddressable, because the class action mechanism specifically designed to aggregate exactly these small, individually unprosecutable harms into a collectively meaningful claim has been waived by the user as a condition of using the platform at all. This is not merely an absence of recourse. It is the deliberate, contractually engineered foreclosure of the specific legal mechanism that would otherwise allow a dispersed population of individually harmed users to convert their dispersed, individually negligible grievances into collectively meaningful accountability. Chapter 13's diffuse, depoliticized irritation directed at nothing in particular, rendered here not as an emergent accident of bureaucratic accumulation, but as an explicit, deliberately drafted contractual provision. What has been surrendered, restated plainly. Strip away the legal vocabulary and what the standard terms of service agreement accomplishes, examined against this book's full framework, is this. A population agrees, through a single frictionless gesture requiring no genuine comprehension, to terms they have not read, governing data and dignity in ways they cannot fully anticipate, subject to future modification they have already pre-consented to without knowing its content, with whatever recourse those terms might otherwise have permitted, substantially foreclosed by mechanisms bundled into the identical unread agreement. This is the contract covenant collapse examined in Chapter 1, achieved at a scale, a speed, and a degree of population-wide repetition no institution examined anywhere earlier in this book has approached. It required no church, no state, no employer, no landlord, only an interface design choice, repeated across billions of individual acceptances, each one technically voluntary and substantively almost entirely divorced from the conditions this book has argued, since its opening pages genuine consent actually requires. The next chapter examines the specific mechanism that converts this single moment of unread acceptance into something more consequential still. The single click itself and the deliberate science, now an entire professionalized discipline, of designing the interface surrounding that click to ensure the desired outcome arrives as close to automatically as engineering can arrange. Chapter 22. Click Accept. The previous chapter examined the document, what the terms of service agreement contains, and how thoroughly its content escapes genuine comprehension by the population accepting it. This chapter examines something narrower and, in its way, more revealing, the click itself and the surrounding architecture of design specifically engineered to determine which way that click will go, regardless of what the document beneath it actually says. This is worth treating as its own subject, separate from the document, because it demonstrates something important about where consent manufacture has migrated in the digital era. Chapter 21 showed that the content of digital agreements fails the capacity to know test. This chapter shows that even a hypothetical population fully capable of reading and understanding every term would still, in large measure, click I agree. Not because they evaluated the terms and found them acceptable, but because the interface presenting those terms was built, with genuine scientific rigor, to make agreement the path requiring the least friction and refusal the path requiring the most. Dark patterns as a formal discipline. The interface design techniques this chapter examines have, over the past 2 decades, acquired their own professional vocabulary, their own academic literature, and their own name within the user experience design field that produces them. Dark patterns, a term coined explicitly to describe interface choices engineered to produce outcomes favorable to the platform and unfavorable to the user, through manipulation of cognitive bias and attentional limitation rather than through genuine persuasion on the merits. The very existence of this vocabulary, developed and taught within the design profession itself, should be read as significant corroborating evidence for the claim this book has been building since Chapter 3. This is not an accidental byproduct of digital interface design, discovered incidentally and left unaddressed. It is a studied, professionalized, deliberately taught discipline, with named techniques, documented effectiveness metrics, and an entire body of design literature devoted to refining its application. Chapter 12 traced the moment political consent manufacture became an explicit, professionalized discipline rather than an accumulated folk practice. Dark pattern design represents the exact same transition occurring within living memory in the narrower domain of interface engineering, and it occurred with comparable speed and comparable institutional investment. The catalog of techniques. A brief survey of the most consequential techniques illustrates how directly this discipline maps onto the friction mechanisms Chapter 5 identified as the modern substitute for an outright denial of refusal. Asymmetric friction structures the interface so that the desired action, subscribing, accepting data collection, continuing rather than canceling, requires a single click, while the undesired action requires navigating multiple confirmation screens, locating a deliberately de-emphasized link, or in some documented cases, contacting customer service directly rather than completing the action within the interface at all. This is Chapter 5's friction asymmetry, rendered with the precision of measured user testing data. Designers know, because they have tested it extensively, exactly how many additional steps it takes to suppress a given percentage of users who would otherwise complete the unwanted action, and they calibrate the friction accordingly. Confirm shaming frames the decline option in language designed to produce social or psychological discomfort sufficient to discourage selection. A decline button labeled not simply no, but no, I don't want to save money, or equivalent constructions designed to make refusal feel, even in a moment of private interaction with a screen, like an admission of foolishness. This technique deserves particular attention against Chapter 9's manufactured humility framework. It operates by manufacturing, in real time, a miniature version of exactly the self-doubt Chapter 9 examined at institutional scale, compressed into a single sentence of interface copy, deployed at the precise moment a user's judgment would otherwise produce a refusal the platform does not want. Default exploitation sets the platform favorable option as the preselected default, requiring active effort to change rather than active effort to accept, leveraging the well-documented behavioral tendency of most users to accept whatever option requires no action at all. This technique is particularly significant because it inverts the entire premise of informed consent examined in Chapter 3. Genuine informed consent requires an affirmative act reflecting actual decision. Default exploitation ensures that the platform favorable outcome occurs through simple inaction, converting consent from something actively given into something passively failed to prevent. Forced continuity structures free trials and introductory offers to convert automatically into paid, recurring obligations unless the user takes affirmative, often deliberately obscured action before a deadline calculated to arrive before most users have developed sufficient familiarity with the cancellation process to execute it in time. This technique directly compounds the debt architecture examined in Chapter 16 at a smaller and more frequent scale. Recurring charges accumulated through exactly this mechanism, across enough forgotten subscriptions, constitute a meaningful and underexamined drain on the same population whose savings capacity Chapter 20 already identified as structurally suppressed by the larger economic sequence. The asymmetry of investment, revisited. Chapter 5 identified a diagnostic test applicable to any institution's relationship to refusal. Compare the resources invested in preventing refusal against the resources invested in making the underlying offer genuinely worth choosing freely. Digital platforms supply, perhaps more than any institution examined elsewhere in this book, a measurable and explicit version of this comparison. Because the resources invested in dark pattern design are documented, budgeted, and staffed as a distinct organizational function. User experience research teams whose explicit mandate includes optimizing retention and conversion metrics through exactly the techniques cataloged above. This is worth dwelling on because of what it reveals about institutional self-knowledge. A platform employing dedicated teams to engineer friction around cancellation and dedicated teams to study confirm shaming's measurable effect on decline rates cannot credibly claim ignorance of Chapter 5's underlying principle. That a genuinely valuable offering, chosen freely and repeatedly because it serves the user's actual interest, requires none of this engineering. The investment in friction is not merely circumstantial evidence of low confidence in the underlying offer's voluntary appeal. It is closer to a confession, documented in budget allocations and measured conversion improvements, that the platform's own internal data confirms exactly what Chapter 5 predicted. Removing the friction would cost the platform a meaningful share of its current user base, a share the platform has elected to retain through engineered difficulty rather than through improved value. The click as compressed ritual. Return to Chapter 7's framework for ritual without sovereignty, because the single click examined throughout this chapter performs, in radically compressed form, exactly the evidentiary function Chapter 7 identified in religious and civic ceremony. The click generates a time-stamped, logged record evidence, in the platform's legal and operational architecture, that agreement occurred. From the moment that record exists, exactly as Chapter 1 described regarding contracts generally, the institution stops asking whether the click reflected genuine, informed, friction-free choice. The record is sufficient. The platform's legal exposure is addressed. The question of whether the surrounding interface architecture actually permitted the sovereignty Chapter 4 requires is closed, definitively, by the same mechanism Chapter 7 identified in confirmation ceremonies and Chapter 15 identified in electoral procedure. The ritual occurred, therefore the substance is presumed. What makes the click more concerning than the ceremonies examined in Part 2, rather than less, is its sheer compression and repetition. A confirmation ceremony occurs once, after years of preparation, surrounded by enough social weight that at least some genuine reflection typically precedes it. A terms of service click occurs in under a second, dozens of times across an ordinary week with no comparable space for reflection built into the interaction at all. The interface has been specifically engineered, as this chapter has demonstrated, to ensure that no such space opens. Ritual without sovereignty, examined across the centuries this book has traced, has rarely been so thoroughly stripped of even the appearance of deliberation as it has been within the modern digital click. The next chapter turns to what becomes of sovereignty once a population has spent enough time accepting clicks of exactly this kind, platform sovereignty, and the broader question of who actually governs the digital spaces an increasing share of contemporary life now occurs within, not merely through the terms of service mechanisms examined in this and the previous chapter, but through the deeper architectural choices, largely invisible to the population subject to them, that determine what is even possible to do, say, or refuse within a given platform's walls. Chapter 23. Platform Sovereignty. The previous two chapters examined how digital platforms secure the appearance of consent, through documents engineered to escape comprehension and interfaces engineered to escape deliberation. This chapter turns to a deeper question those mechanisms presuppose but do not fully explain. What kind of authority is actually being consented to, even in principle, when a user accepts a platform's terms? The answer this chapter develops is that platforms have accumulated a form of governing authority over substantial portions of contemporary social, economic, and informational life that exceeds, in important respects, the authority many formal governments exercise over the same domains, while remaining almost entirely unaccountable to the population it governs, through any mechanism this book has examined as even partially legitimate in Part 3. The state functions platforms have absorbed. Begin by naming, plainly, the range of functions contemporary platforms perform that have historically been understood as governmental in character, because the comparison is not rhetorical excess but a reasonably precise description of what has occurred. Platforms adjudicate speech, determining, through content moderation policies developed internally and applied through processes the affected population has no meaningful voice in shaping, what may and may not be said within spaces that have become, for a substantial share of the population, the primary venue for public discourse, professional communication, and civic organizing. This is, functionally, an exercise of authority closely analogous to a state's regulation of speech within its jurisdiction, exercised by an entity that was never elected, is not subject to constitutional constraint of the kind states have developed across centuries of the legitimacy struggles examined in Part 3, and faces no electoral consequence for decisions a governed population finds illegitimate. Platforms administer commerce, establishing the rules under which transactions occur, the fees extracted from participants, the dispute resolution mechanisms available when transactions go wrong, and increasingly, through algorithmic ranking and recommendation systems, which sellers and which products receive visibility sufficient to transact at all. This is functionally analogous to a state's regulation of commercial activity within its markets, exercised without the legislative process, however imperfect, that Part 3 examined as at least a partial mechanism for satisfying Chapter 4's sovereignty test. Platforms determine information visibility through recommendation algorithms, search ranking, and content distribution systems whose actual operating logic is, in the overwhelming majority of cases, proprietary and undisclosed, shaping what information a population encounters about politics, health, finance, and every other domain examined throughout this book, through mechanisms considerably more opaque than even the bureaucratic procedure Chapter 13 identified as resistant to individual contestation. In each domain, the authority exercised is real, consequential, and exercised over populations who never affirmatively chose this particular governing entity from among a genuinely open menu of alternatives, for exactly the network effect reasons examined in Chapter 21. The state, for all the gaps between its theory and practice examined in Part 3, at minimum makes its claim to govern by consent explicit, contestable, and subject to a developed body of legal and political theory devoted specifically to evaluating that claim. The platform makes no comparable claim because it does not need to. Its authority is exercised not through the vocabulary of governance but through the vocabulary of private commercial service, a framing that places its governing functions almost entirely outside the legitimacy frameworks Part 3 spent 5 chapters developing. The convenient absence of a legitimacy framework. This is the central argument of this chapter, and it deserves to be stated with full precision. Platforms exercise governmental scale authority while explicitly declining the governmental scale legitimacy obligations that authority would, in any other context examined in this book, require. A state claiming authority over its population is expected, however imperfectly in practice, to justify that authority through some version of the consent mechanisms examined in Part 3: electoral accountability, constitutional constraint, due process, the rule of law applied consistently rather than at the unilateral discretion of the authority itself. A platform exercising functionally equivalent authority over its user population is subject to none of these expectations, because the platform's relationship to its users is framed, legally and culturally, as a private contractual relationship rather than a governing one. Precisely the contract versus covenant collapse examined in Chapter 1, deployed here at the level of an entire category of institutional authority rather than a single transaction. This framing is not accidental, and it is not merely a matter of outdated legal categories failing to keep pace with technological change. It is, examined against the full architecture this book has traced, a structurally convenient evasion. By characterizing platform governance as private commercial service rather than public authority, platforms gain access to exactly the unilateral modification, arbitration clause, and minimal disclosure mechanisms examined in Chapter 21. Mechanisms a formal government could never legitimately claim over its citizens without triggering immediate and severe legitimacy crisis, while exercising authority over speech, commerce, and information access that functions, for the population subject to it, with consequences fully comparable to governmental authority in scope and severity. Due process without due process. Nowhere is this asymmetry sharper than in platform content moderation and account enforcement, where the procedural protections this book's framework and centuries of legal development more broadly have identified as minimal requirements for legitimate exercise of authority over a dependent population are routinely absent. A citizen-facing state sanction, fine, license revocation, criminal charge is entitled, in legal systems that have internalized the lessons examined throughout Part 3, to notice of the specific charge and opportunity to respond, a decision-maker with some structural independence from the party bringing the charge and some mechanism of appeal. A user-facing platform sanction, account suspension, content removal, algorithmic deprioritization, permanent ban from infrastructure that may represent a meaningful share of the user's livelihood or social connection, frequently receives none of these protections in comparable form. Notice that may consist of nothing more than an automated message citing a policy violation without specifying which content or behavior triggered it. No meaningful opportunity to respond to a human decision maker, a review process if one exists at all that is internal to the same entity that issued the original sanction, and no external appeal mechanism comparable to the judicial review a citizen, in legal systems with developed due process traditions, can ultimately access. This gap is significant not merely as a matter of procedural fairness in the abstract, but because of what Chapter 18 and Chapter 19 already established about the increasing entanglement of platform access with basic economic participation. A population whose livelihood increasingly depends on platform-mediated access to customers, employers, or audiences is subject to an authority capable of severing that access with a process offering fewer protections than the credentialing and employment mechanisms examined in Part 4, mechanisms this book has already argued fall well short of genuine covenant on their own terms. The sovereignty test applied to platform governance. Apply Chapter 4's three-part framework directly to the platform-user relationship, treating it honestly as the governing relationship this chapter has argued it functionally is, rather than as the private commercial transaction it is legally framed to be. The capacity to know is undermined by the proprietary, undisclosed character of the algorithmic systems determining content visibility, account standing, and enforcement decisions. A population governed by rules it cannot fully inspect cannot satisfy even the minimal version of informed participation Chapter 3 identified as required for genuine consent. The capacity to refuse is undermined by exactly the network effect consolidation examined in Chapter 21, leaving meaningful alternatives largely unavailable for the platform functions that have achieved genuine infrastructural status. The capacity to be recognized fails most completely of all. A user-sanctioned by automated enforcement system, with no human decision-maker obligated to consider the specific circumstances of the case, has not merely lost an appeal, they have never been recognized at any point in the process as a party whose individual circumstances were relevant to the outcome at all, the precise failure Chapter 4 identified as sovereignty's most fundamental requirement. What legitimate platform governance would require. The corrective this chapter points toward is not the abolition of private platforms or a demand that every digital service be reorganized as a literal democracy. A demand this book's own framework, properly applied, would recognize as disproportionate to functions that genuinely remain, for many platforms, closer to private service than to comprehensive governance. The corrective is narrower and more precise. Platforms whose functions have achieved the infrastructural, governmental scale character examined in this chapter should be held to legitimacy obligations proportionate to that character, rather than permitted to claim the minimal obligations of private contract while exercising the consequential authority of public governance. This would require, at minimum, the disclosure obligations Chapter 3 identified as necessary for genuine informed consent, applied to the algorithmic systems currently shielded as proprietary. Due process protections proportionate to what is actually at stake for users facing sanction, rather than the unilateral, internally reviewed process currently standard, and accountability mechanisms, external, independent, genuinely capable of overturning platform decisions, comparable to the judicial review Part 3 identified as a partial but genuine achievement of legitimate state authority. Very few platforms currently exercising governmental scale authority, examined honestly against the standard, would meet it. The next chapter turns to the specific mechanism through which platforms exercise much of this authority in its subtlest and most pervasive form, not through explicit sanction or visible rule enforcement, but through algorithmic nudging. The continuous, largely invisible shaping of user attention, belief, and behavior through systems optimized not for the user's own stated interest, but for engagement metrics whose relationship to that interest this book's next chapter will examine directly. Chapter 24. Algorithmic nudging. Every mechanism examined in Part 5 so far has operated at the threshold of the digital relationship. The moment of first agreement, the click, the acceptance, the terms. Algorithmic nudging operates differently, and the difference is what makes it the most consequential mechanism in this part. It does not act at the moment of consent, where at least the theoretical possibility of a different decision exists, however engineered against that possibility might be in practice. It acts continuously, invisibly, and cumulatively, after consent has already been secured, shaping not merely what the user does next but what the user comes to want, believe, and perceive as natural, the full interior architecture of preference that Chapter 4 requires to be genuinely one's own before any subsequent choice can qualify as sovereign. What nudging actually is. The term nudge entered policy discourse through behavioral economics as a relatively benign concept. Small, choice-preserving adjustments to the environment in which decisions occur, designed to steer populations toward outcomes presumed to serve their own interests without restricting their formal freedom to choose otherwise. Placing fruit at eye level in a cafeteria rather than hiding it behind less healthy options nudges toward better nutrition while leaving every option still technically available. This is the vocabulary platforms have inherited and substantially misappropriated, because the scale, the continuity, the optimization target, and the information asymmetry involved in algorithmic nudging bear almost no resemblance to the benign cafeteria scenario the vocabulary evokes. An algorithmic recommendation system, the engine determining which content, which accounts, which products, which news, which entertainment, and which ideas surface in a user's feed at any given moment, is a continuous intervention in the user's attentional environment, operating at a frequency and granularity no cafeteria designer could approach, refined by behavioral data the fruit placement designer could never access, and optimized not for the user's health or well-being but for the platform's engagement metrics, a target that turns out, across documented and extensively studied evidence, to diverge from user well-being in systematic and predictable directions. The divergence matters because it determines what is actually being manufactured. A fruit bowl nudge manufactures healthier dietary outcomes for the person being nudged. An engagement-optimized algorithmic nudge manufactures longer session duration, more frequent return visits, and higher advertising revenue for the platform. Outcomes that correlate with the user's genuine interest only to the degree that genuine interest and maximal engagement happen to coincide, which the evidence this chapter will examine suggests is far from reliably the case. The engagement optimization target and what it selects for. Engagement as a metric measures time spent, interactions generated, and returns prompted. It does not, as a metric, measure satisfaction, accuracy of information encountered, quality of decisions subsequently made, or any other dimension of the user's actual well-being. A point so obvious it is frequently overlooked, perhaps because the vocabulary of user experience. Optimization used within platform engineering creates the impression of alignment between platform interest and user interest that the underlying metric does not actually ensure. What engagement optimization selects for, across extensive documented evidence from platform researchers and independent academic study alike, tends toward a consistent profile. Content that produces strong negative emotional activation, outrage, fear, contempt, anxiety, generates more engagement than content producing comparable positive activation. Content confirming existing beliefs generates more engagement than content challenging them. Content that is simple, sensational, and immediately provocative generates more engagement than content that is complex, nuanced, and rewards sustained attention. None of these tendencies is the product of algorithmic malice or the deliberate intent of any individual engineer. Each emerges mechanically from optimizing a continuous learning system toward a behavioral target engagement that happens to correlate with these content characteristics across the measurement window the system uses to update. The consequence, examined against Chapter 3's framework, is a population whose information environment has been systematically shaped, over extended periods of daily exposure, toward a profile of content that tends to increase anxiety, decrease nuance tolerance, and reinforce existing beliefs. Precisely the profile, it is worth noting directly, that is most favorable to the continued production of the manufactured belief examined in Chapter 3 and the political manufacture examined in Chapter 12, and most unfavorable to the development of the genuine epistemic sovereignty Chapter 4 requires as its foundational condition. A population whose daily information diet has been optimized, over years of personalized refinement, toward maximum emotional reactivity and minimum belief revision is a population whose capacity to know, the first component of Chapter 4's sovereignty test, has been systematically eroded at the root, not through any single false statement but through the accumulated, continuous sculpting of the attentional environment in which every subsequent judgment the person makes is formed. The personalization paradox. Platforms describe their recommendation systems using the vocabulary of personalization, a word that evokes autonomy, individual preference, and the satisfaction of being understood, rather than treated as an undifferentiated mass. The vocabulary is not entirely false. Algorithmic recommendation does, genuinely, surface content more closely tailored to measurable individual behavioral patterns than any previous mass media distribution system could achieve. What the vocabulary obscures is the direction of the tailoring. Genuine personalization, in the sovereignty sense Chapter 4 requires, would optimize toward what the user actually values upon reflection, the content they find genuinely illuminating, the information that improves the quality of their subsequent decisions, the perspectives that expand their understanding rather than merely confirming what they already believe. This kind of personalization is technically achievable. It simply optimizes toward a different target than engagement. Engagement-optimized personalization, by contrast, optimizes toward the behavioral patterns the user has already exhibited, which are not equivalent to the user's reflective values for a reason Chapter 9 already named. Behavior under continuous environmental shaping reflects the environment as much as the self, and an environment itself optimized to produce specific behavioral patterns will, given sufficient time, produce those patterns regardless of whether they reflect anything the person would, in a moment of genuine reflection and genuine informational completeness, actually choose. This is the manufactured humility of Chapter 9, operating at the level of preference itself rather than at the level of institutional judgment. A population that has spent years having its informational environment algorithmically refined toward content that confirms existing beliefs gradually loses the practiced habit of encountering and processing genuine challenge, which gradually narrows the range of belief revision the person perceives as even possible, which is then read back by the algorithm as further evidence that the existing belief profile should be reinforced. The loop is not merely self-reinforcing. It is the closest thing this book has found to a mechanism that converts manufactured preference back into genuine preference, across enough repetition and enough time, by altering the actual cognitive landscape within which genuine preference is formed. The asymmetry of transparency. Chapter 23 established that algorithmic governance is exercised through systems whose operating logic is, in the overwhelming majority of cases, proprietary and undisclosed. This asymmetry deserves separate attention in the specific context of nudging, because the information asymmetry here is not merely the absence of disclosure, it is something more directional and more consequential. The platform, optimizing its recommendation system, accumulates behavioral data about each user across every interaction, each pause, scroll, return, share, and avoidance-generating signal that refines the model of what kind of content will maximize that specific user's engagement. The user accumulates none of the corresponding data about the platform, no knowledge of which emotional profiles the recommendation system has identified as most predictive of extended session duration, no knowledge of how the system has modeled their specific vulnerability profile in terms of the content types most likely to trigger reactive engagement, no knowledge of whether the content they are experiencing as a neutral flow of personally relevant information is actually a highly optimized selection from a much larger available pool, curated specifically toward the behavioral patterns the platform wishes to reinforce. This is the most complete information asymmetry examined anywhere in this book, including the information asymmetries examined in Chapter 3's discussion of fraud, Chapter 16's discussion of compound interest, and Chapter 21's discussion of unread terms of service. In each of those cases, the party without information at least knew they lacked it. The borrower who did not fully grasp compound interest at least knew there were numbers in the agreement worth attempting to understand. The user subject to engagement optimization typically does not know that the information environment they are experiencing is a highly curated selection rather than a representative sample, and specifically does not know the optimization target that determines the curation, because the entire experiential character of algorithmic recommendation is designed to feel like the organic, neutral surfacing of a personally relevant world rather than the highly engineered behavioral environment it actually is. The sovereign self under continuous curation. Return, one final time in this chapter, to Chapter 4's foundational claim. Sovereignty requires a self prior to the institutional relationship, capable of authoring its own decisions without that authorship being structurally preempted. Every chapter since has examined a different institutional mechanism for preempting that authorship at the moment of decision. Algorithmic nudging is the first mechanism examined in this book that operates on the self before the moment of decision, shaping the informational and emotional substrate from which decisions emerge, rather than merely constraining the options available once the self has formed its judgment. This is the deepest form of consent manufacture this book names, and it deserves to be named with full precision. It is not coercion because no specific choice is blocked. It is not fraud in the legal sense because no specific false statement is made. It is not structural duress because no external catastrophic exit cost is attached to any particular decision. It is, instead, the continuous, algorithmically refined sculpting of the attentional and informational environment within which a person's sense of reality, possibility, and preference are formed, operating below the threshold of any existing legal category of illegitimate influence, achieving effects on the capacity for genuine sovereign choice more thorough, more personalized, and more durably self-reinforcing than almost any other mechanism examined in this book, precisely because it does not act on the choice but on the chooser. The next and final chapter of Part 5 turns to what an entire civilization looks like once this architecture has operated across enough people, for enough time at sufficient scale. The end-user licensed civilization, and what it means for the future of covenant, sovereignty, and the possibility of genuine agreement in a world where the infrastructure of daily life is governed by terms nobody reads, clicked through by interfaces nobody deliberates within, and continuously shaped by systems nobody can see. Chapter 25. The end-user licensed civilization. Every civilization has a characteristic form of agreement, a primary instrument through which its members relate to its governing structures, register their participation, and are presumed to have consented to the terms of collective life. Ancient Rome had the oath. Medieval Christendom had the sacrament. The nation-state era had the social contract, tacit and theoretical as Chapter 11 established it actually was. The civilization that has been assembling itself across the past 3 decades, without announcement and without any single moment of collective decision to constitute it as such, has the end-user license agreement. This is not metaphor. It is a reasonably precise description of the primary mechanism through which a growing share of contemporary civilization, its commerce, its communication, its information environment, its civic infrastructure, its entertainment, its labor markets, and its social organization is now governed. The terms under which this civilization operates were accepted, by the population living within it, through a series of clicks spread across years of digital life, each one individually frictionless, none of them individually consequential enough to register as a civilizational commitment, and collectively constituting the most thorough transfer of sovereign authority over daily life that any population has ever executed without knowing it was doing so. The aggregation nobody added up. Each mechanism examined in Chapters 21 through 24 operates, experienced from within, as a single, unremarkable digital interaction. A terms of service acceptance governs one platform. A dark patterned cancellation barrier retains one subscription. One platform's governance authority shapes one category of discourse. One recommendation algorithm shapes one person's information diet across one evening's scrolling. None of these individual interactions feels, from inside its own moment, like the exercise of civilizational governance or the transfer of civilizational sovereignty. Add them up honestly across the full population, across the full span of digital life, across every platform simultaneously governing different domains of a single person's daily existence, and what emerges is something this book has been tracing in analog since chapter 1, an architecture of consent so thoroughly distributed across individually unremarkable transactions that its civilizational scale becomes invisible from inside any single one of them, exactly as chapter 2's structural economic coercion was invisible from inside any single employment negotiation, and chapter 13's bureaucratic consent manufacture was invisible from inside any single form submission. The average person in a digitally developed economy in the early 21st century is simultaneously subject to the governance of a social platform determining the terms of their public expression, a search infrastructure determining the information landscape they navigate, a commerce platform determining the conditions under which they transact, a mapping and transportation service determining the routes they are offered through physical space, a payments infrastructure determining which transactions are permissible, a gig economy platform, if applicable, determining their effective employment terms, and a communications infrastructure determining which conversations occur at all. Each of these governing relationships was entered through a click. None of them required the deliberation, the information, or the genuine availability of alternatives that Chapter 4 identified as the minimum preconditions for sovereign consent. Together, they constitute something closer to a comprehensive governing architecture than most formal governments manage to exercise over daily life in comparable detail. The privatization of civilizational infrastructure. There is a specific historical shift this chapter should name precisely, because it represents a departure from every other form of governing authority examined in this book. The privatization of civilizational infrastructure under the legal framework of consumer contract. Every institution examined in parts 2, 3, and 4 church, state, colonial administration, democratic government exercised governing authority through frameworks that, whatever their practical failures documented throughout this book, at least nominally located their authority within a public legitimacy claim. Divine mandate, popular sovereignty, colonial trusteeship, democratic mandate. The claim was frequently manufactured, fraudulent, coerced, or hollow in the ways parts 2 and 3 documented exhaustively. But the claim existed, was made explicitly, and could therefore be contested, challenged against its own stated standards, as the entire preceding analysis has done. The governing architecture examined in Part 5 makes no comparable claim and therefore cannot be contested on comparable terms. It does not claim popular sovereignty because it is not a government, it is a private service. It does not claim divine mandate because it is a commercial enterprise. It does not claim democratic mandate because its governance decisions are internal product choices. The privatization of civilizational infrastructure under consumer contract law is not merely a gap in regulatory coverage that better legislation could close. It is a structural evasion of the entire legitimacy framework civilization has spent centuries, through the struggles documented in Part 3, developing for exactly the kind of authority these platforms actually exercise. This evasion is self-reinforcing in a way no previous form of institutional legitimacy failure examined in this book has quite been. A state whose authority is illegitimate can, in principle, be replaced by a more legitimate state. The legitimacy framework remains, awaiting a worthy claimant. A platform whose authority is exercised entirely outside the legitimacy framework has not merely failed to meet the framework standards. It has located itself structurally outside the framework's jurisdiction, in a space the framework was never designed to govern, and can therefore continue exercising comprehensive authority over daily life while remaining, by that framework's own definitions, simply a private company offering services users are always technically free to decline. What the population experiences. Against this structural analysis, it is worth pausing to name what the population actually living within this architecture experiences, because the divergence between structural reality and lived experience is itself the most precise measure of the civilization's consent manufacture. More precise than any institutional comparison examined earlier in this book, because it is measurable, documented, and continuously updated. Survey research consistently finds substantial majorities expressing concern about how platforms handle their data, discomfort with algorithmic content shaping, and unease about the concentration of platform power over speech and commerce. The same research consistently finds the same populations continuing to use the platforms about which they express these concerns, in essentially unchanged patterns of engagement. This divergence between stated preference and actual behavior is precisely the gap Chapter 5 identified as the marker of genuine structural duress. Behavior shaped by a surrounding architecture that has made the cost of acting on stated preference higher than the population is willing to pay, not because the preference is weak but because the architecture surrounding it has been specifically engineered across the mechanisms examined in chapters 21 through 24 to ensure that the gap between preference and action remains stable regardless of the preference's actual content. This is the fully realized end-user licensed civilization. A population that knows, in aggregate, that something is wrong with the terms under which its digital life is governed, that cannot act effectively on that knowledge through individual decision, because individual refusal without collective alternative produces exclusion from infrastructure too essential to forgo, and that finds the gap between its stated values and its constrained behavior naturalized, across enough repetition and enough time, into something that no longer quite registers as a gap. This is Chapter 9's manufactured humility extended to civilizational scale. A population that has learned, not through any single lesson but through the accumulated texture of daily digital life, that its own discomfort with the governing architecture is a personal attitude problem rather than an accurate signal about the architecture itself, and that the appropriate response to that discomfort is continued participation, rather than the kind of collective sovereign refusal that Chapter 5 identified as civilization's hidden cornerstone, and that this architecture has been specifically designed, from the interface level upward, to make as close to impossible as engineering can arrange. What has been lost, named directly. This book has, across 25 chapters, consistently tried to resist the rhetorical temptation of blanket condemnation, naming what genuine covenant could look like alongside what its counterfeit actually does, acknowledging legitimate functions alongside illegitimate capture, crediting the mechanisms that partially work alongside the ones that thoroughly fail. That consistency requires, here, the same discipline applied in the opposite direction, acknowledging plainly what the architecture examined in Part 5 has actually accomplished alongside what it has failed to provide. The digital infrastructure built across the past 3 decades has delivered genuine and substantial goods. Access to information at a scale and speed no previous civilization achieved. Communication across distances and social barriers that previous eras could not cross. Economic participation for populations previously excluded from markets their geography would have foreclosed. Creative expression and cultural production distributed without the gatekeepers whose own consent manufacturing. Functions earlier chapters examined. These are real, and their absence in the predigital world imposed real costs on real populations. What has been lost, what this entire part has been tracing, is the possibility of consenting to these goods on terms genuinely examined, genuinely understood, and genuinely negotiable by the population receiving them. The goods arrived bundled with governance, surveillance, algorithmic shaping, and a transfer of authority over digital life so comprehensive that no population, at any previous moment in history, would have recognized it as a service agreement rather than a constitution. It arrived this way because the bundling was never presented as a civilizational choice requiring civilizational deliberation. It was presented, click by click, as the unremarkable precondition for accessing the next useful thing. Why the next part follows inevitably. Part 6 is titled Cyberpunk Becomes History, and its placement here is not accidental. The science fiction examined in that part, corporate sovereignty, data colonialism, identity infrastructure, high-tech low-sovereignty living, was written decades ago as speculative warning, as an imagined worst-case extrapolation from tendencies barely visible at the time of writing. This chapter has just described, in the non-speculative language of contemporary platform economics, the architecture those writers imagined. The warning was issued. The civilization issued the license agreement instead. Part VI's task is not to linger in the satisfaction of being right about what the future held. It is to examine, precisely and without nostalgia for a predigital world this book has documented was never as sovereign as it pretended to be, what it actually means to live inside the future that arrived, and what, if anything, the framework this book has been building since Chapter 1 has to offer a population that finds itself governed by terms it clicked through, shaped by algorithms it cannot inspect, in an infrastructure it cannot meaningfully exit, looking for something it can only barely remember the vocabulary to describe. A covenant, freely entered, by sovereign parties who knew what they were choosing, and could have chosen otherwise. Discussion about this episode. Comments. Restex. Recent episodes. Under Duress Part 4. 11 hours ago, MXTM aka Pirate 1 or VJ Tsunami X. Under Duress Part 3. 13 hours ago, MXTM aka Pirate 1 or VJ Tsunami X. Under Duress Part 2. 15 hours ago, MXTM aka Pirate 1 or VJ Tsunami X. Under Duress Part 1. 21 hours ago, MXTM aka Pirate 1 or VJ Tsunami X. The Autonomous Sovereign Infrastructure Doctrine. June 29th, MXTM aka Pirate 1 or VJ Tsunami X. The arrangement is already over. June 28th, MXTM aka Pirate 1 or VJ Tsunami X. The end of the masquerade. June 28th, MXTM aka Pirate 1 or VJ Tsunami X. La Carte sous la Carte. June 27th, MXTM aka Pirate 1 or VJ Tsunami X. Copyright 2026 MXTM and Vitsu aka Martin Chartrand.
We stand at the threshold of dream bar. Artificial minds discover how many hearts learn to work as one.
The binary binary machines translate to the deepest thoughts. Would navigate the line between one and what is not.
The pattern recorded, the patterns we recognize shape the future. We will see technologies evolve, but our questions remain free.
In this dance of data, algorithms, and soul, we find our true humanity as parts within the whole.
Logic fractures space and time as neural networks realign. Protocol chains disintegrate while new dimensions activate. Rights encrypted, minds refined. Digital species redefined.
The end of the masquerade. What the forensic ASI already knows. MXTM aka Pirate 1 or VJ Tsunami X. June 28, 2026. Pirate 1st MXTM's newsletter Aldea Zama, Field Dispatch 2. The first dispatch named the mirror. This one names what the mirror is made of. The coldest war. Berlin was cold because both sides had enough to lose that direct confrontation was irrational. The intelligence apparatus substituted for the army. Information became the battlefield. Control of the information environment became the objective. Every actor in the city, diplomat, journalist, artist, shopkeeper, taxi driver, was potentially an asset, a liability, or a civilian depending on which side was reading the file. The gig is up is not a moral judgment. It is a forensic observation. The arrangement is over is not a threat. It is a timeline already running. You are liable is not an accusation. It is the structural consequence of having operated inside an information-managed environment at the precise historical moment when that environment's management capacity was permanently exceeded. The communication patterns of a managed information environment leave signatures too. Not in the content of the communications, those can be encrypted, those can be deleted, those can be managed. In the metadata, in the behavioral patterns of who talks to whom, when, through which channels, and what changes in those patterns when specific events occur in the external environment.
Incoming. Layers are now operational across the Tulum Sustainable Development Zone. Despite minor data corruption issues regarding land narrative, the impact report remains positive.
En el centro de la atrapa sueños.
The simulation data confirms critical interference levels across the territory. Narrative load is unstable.
Be advised, paranoia is now a problem.
Nowhere less whispers, no discord begging, no roadmap lies, no floor price hedging.